We're continuing our study of the Seminar of Jacques Lacan, Book 1, Freud's Papers on Technique, 1953 to 1954. This time we're looking at Chapter 14, The Fluctuations of the Libido. Here we see Lacan stressing time and time again that the therapeutic process is a fluid process and that the work that needs to be done moves in different stages. And if we were to take any of these stages in isolation, it would seem counterintuitive or contradictory to later phases of the process. This lesson, in Chapter 14, begins with a question raised by psychoanalyst Robert Pujol, who is confused about Lacan's maxim, desire is the desire of the other. Pujol asks on page 176, is it the desire which is in the other, or the desire that I have for the other? Lacan likes slippery aphorisms because he can get multiple uses out of them. But here he answers Pujol very directly that what the aphorism means for now is desire rooted in the other. That is, the desire rooted in some authority figure or some outside person, quote, as it is rooted in the imaginary, end quote. To return to our Lacanian terms, the imaginary is the ordinary world of the senses. So in this context, this inkling of desire that the subject gets is the misrecognition of the locus of desire as being outside himself or herself. It's odd, Lacan thinks. We locate desire outside ourselves at first, and then to come to make peace with our unconscious desires, we have to claw to get it back. He explains it like this on page 176. Quote, man knows that he is a body, although he never perceives it in a complete fashion, since he is inside it, but he knows it. This image is the ring, the bottleneck, through which the confused bundle of desires and needs must pass in order to be him, that is to say, in order to accede to his imaginary structure. End quote. We say desire is outside us, not in us, and fight for that, Lacan thinks. But Lacan warns on page 177, quote, it doesn't stop there, end quote. This whole interplay of desire is a seesaw, Lacan believes. He believes it's fluid. On page 177, Lacan says we move into what he calls a, quote, second moment. In the human subject, desire is realized in the other, and by the other, in the second moment, when the subject has integrated the form of the ego, end quote. The subject accepts his or her own ego formation in view of the other, but, quote, he is only capable of integrating it after a first swing of the seesaw when he has precisely exchanged his ego for this desire which he sees in the other. From then on, the desire of the other, which is man's desire, enters into the mediation of language. It is in the other, by the other, that desire is named. It enters into the symbolic relation of I and you, in a relation of mutual recognition and transcendence, into the order of the law, which is already quite ready to encompass the history of each individual. End quote. This seems a bit complicated, more than a bit complicated, so let's unpack it. The normal healthy subject locates his wants and desires outside himself and forms his ego in terms of other people's desires. He subordinates his world of the senses, the imaginary, to this big other. But that is only the first step. The next step is, in the subject's development, he or she recognizes that the world is not only a system of sense, but also of rules. It's a symbolic system. So the next phase with the healthy subject is that he or she subordinates himself or herself to the symbolic world and accepts the symbolic terms, the rules and regulations of the social world in which desire tends to be expressed. Now, all of this occurs surprisingly early, Lacan believes. Lacan again uses the example of Freud's grandson to illustrate the point. Freud's grandson, a baby, is barely old enough to speak, and yet he has anxieties about his separation from his mother. At first he cries uncontrollably, but then at some point he begins to take a top, a spinning top, tied to a string. He throws it out of his crib. He cries gone. Then he pulls it back and he cries there. Lacan sees this as an example of the little boy getting his anxieties in check, and he's trying to make them conform to a language that provides added symbolic sense to his uncomfortable situation. For the sake of argument, let's assume that Lacan is correct, that this is how human development works, that we move through these stages of the sensory world and then we come to adapt to the symbolic world of rules and laws and regulations. Assuming that this picture of development is correct, it's worth asking how the developmental process might go astray. Well, as we've already said, the two broad categories for Lacan in terms of mental health problems are psychosis and neurosis. Malformation of the psyche is entirely different for psychosis than it is for neurosis. Lacan believes that neurosis develops because a person hasn't given full voice or full speech to unconscious desires. Lacan says, if we move to page 183, quote, speech is that dimension through which the desire of the subject is authentically integrated onto the symbolic plane. It is only once it is formulated, named in the presence of the other, that desire, whatever it is recognized in the full sense of the term. End quote. Let's stop there. Thank you for listening.